all, thank you all for coming. My name is Yuna Her. I'm a senior studying cognitive science and education, and I'm one of the organizers for 2018 Theories in Action.
Yep, so my name's Meg. I'm the other coordinator of Theories in Action, and we're so excited to have you guys here today. We have over 60 seniors participating in Theories in Action this year, and we have 4 of our lovely presenters here with their four students in our facilitator.
Oh my gosh! Sorry. Oh my gosh! I just counted 5.
Questions off, I think.
So they've titled their presentation today "Ownership over Storytelling," and we'll let them introduce themselves. But we're really excited to have you guys here. So welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody. My name's Jenn Steinfeld, and I work at the Swearer Center for Public Service, and it's my honor to facilitate today's Theory in Action. And I want to introduce our 4 presenters. Nicole Martina, sitting next to me. Her project is called Thrice Upon a Time. Nicole is a literary arts concentrator who watches way too much TV. Luckily, she discovered her passion for screenwriting in her sophomore year and could justify all this TV watching as important research. Next to her is, and I didn't write these, they wrote their own. And next is Clemencia Garcia-Kasimirowski, whose project is titled Reshaping the Refugee Camp, Makeshift Islamic Architectures in Ritsona, Greece. Clemencia is a senior concentrating in history of art and architecture, and her senior thesis on makeshift Islamic architectures in the Ritsona refugee camp in Greece combined her interest in refugee and migration studies with her background in architectural studies. Outside of her academics, Clemencia is a DUG leader for the History of Art and Architecture Department and is a co-president of the Brown French House. Next is Julia Tompkins. Her project is titled Empire Limited. Julia Tompkins is from Brooklyn, New York, and concentrates in English on the nonfiction track. During her time at Brown, she has written and edited for the College Hill Independent and danced on the Polar Bears. In Brooklyn, Julia first became interested in trains and the individuals who ride them, and this interest led her to write her nonfiction thesis on long-haul Amtrak trains. Finally, we'll be hearing from Vandhana Ravi. This project is titled Anarchives, Building Community Narrative. Vandhana is a senior from Bangalore, India. She's an engaged scholar in sociology and double concentrates in literary arts. Through her time at Brown, she's been really interested in different forms of co-creating and documenting knowledge with communities as a form of activism. She created her senior capstone on the importance of public libraries in building digital justice in Providence. So you'll be hearing a presentation from each of them, and then we'll take questions at the end. Nicole, you're up.
Yeah, cool. I'm gonna go up there. Go all the way around. Great, maybe we should leave some space between the table and that next time. Hi, everyone. So since we're such a small and intimate group, I feel comfortable being extremely emotionally vulnerable up here. So get ready for that. So Thrice Upon a Time is my thesis, and it is a little bit more than that. It's also, I consider it my child, very much so. And it is the first 2 episodes of a original sci-fi fantasy sitcom that I conceived of about 1.5 years ago. I was in an advanced screenwriting class, and we needed to come up with a pilot to work on during the semester. And I'm a pretty big sci-fi and fantasy nerd, but I knew I wanted to write a sort of a comedy because I don't know how to be serious in any way, shape, or form. So I was like, do I want to write something in like Renaissance England or the Middle Ages because I love that stuff, or do I want to write something very like futuristic and spacey and whatnot? Because I also am a big fan of that. And I got kind of lazy, so I was like, I'll just do both. So it is a time travel sort of sitcom, and it follows 3 main characters, 3 women from 3 different time periods. It is about, I'll just go to the character page now. So it's about Isobel Jimenez. She is a Latina woman of Costa Rican and indigenous descent, an ambitious writer in NYC. You know what? I'm going to go back because those are some really fun little character drawings, and I'll save them for later. Also follows Marjorie Bennett from Renaissance England. She's a servant who doesn't know she's a lesbian, so that's fun. And also Sophia Perez, who's a cocky Colombian spaceship pilot in the year 2222. A lot of people ask me why I chose that year, and I'm like, it's just easier to remember, just all twos. But essentially, so I wrote this pilot for this class, and it was fine. It wasn't as funny as I wanted it to be, and it was way too long, and people in class are mean. But I knew I had tapped into something that meant a lot to me and was sort of special, so I wanted to follow that. But essentially, at the end of this pilot, these three characters on the top, they all sort of time travel. They fall through this unstable time portal. They time travel to each other's periods. Isabella goes to Renaissance England, Sophia in 2017 New York City, and Marjorie in 2222 space. And so I have always loved this is like a little meme page that I made, drawing credits to my roommate and good friend Talia Dutton, who drew all these characters who are my children. And I just wanted to describe them in a really fun way. I wanted to keep this presentation visual and not show like a scene from my pilot, because I'm emotionally vulnerable today, but not that emotionally vulnerable. But I have always really loved fantasy and sci-fi because they're genres where the impossible should not exist. Restrictions of reality and realistic fiction are not supposed to be there. Yet most of the mainstream sci-fi and fantasy and speculative fiction in general I've consumed throughout my entire life has all been very rooted in Eurocentric, patriarchal sort of cultures and whatnot. I mean, everything is very white and cis and male-dominated, especially in sci-fi. And I'm talking very mainstream stuff, like Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, stuff that I consumed when I was a kid. Not now that I'm older, I've taken like a sci-fi class here now. I've learned about some more niche authors and creators like Octavia Butler, Samuel Delany, who have pushed the boundaries of sci-fi and speculative fiction for a long time, but that wasn't easily accessible to me as a kid, so I really just consumed what I knew. And that was kind of upsetting because I'm not a white man. And it was weird to love these genres where I didn't see myself or people like me, yet it was always very easy to find dragons. So I figured that was kind of a problem. You always wanted to be a writer. I loved storytelling. And when I came here to Brown, and like this possibility of the open curriculum was here, I actually had a lot of guilt, art guilt, like guilt about wanting to create art and to tell stories, because I was like, well, shouldn't I care more about like being a social activist and like being a poli-sci concentrator? And I actually was a concentrator in poli-sci for a bit. And I was like, I should be more involved in wanting to make big change. But I've always been like a very artsy person. I do a lot of theater, I do a lot of comedy, and that's all very important to me. So I guess in terms of this theme, connecting the dots, it's been a bit of a struggle to reconcile that there is a way for me to prioritize both those things, to prioritize art and to also prioritize like wanting to make some sort of change. And being here with like all these different communities and taking all these classes and meeting all these great people have, helped me realize that like, because representation was very important to me as a kid and is very important to me now and to a lot of other people, I can make change in the art that I create by creating this diverse group of characters and these diverse stories, and by having stories where marginalized and underrepresented identities, like LGBT people and people of color and disabled people who feel left out of stories, have a space where they can feel welcome, they can feel represented, and they can have, they can like enjoy sci-fi and fantasy for what it is supposed to be, which is a place where these restrictions of like the real world like are not supposed to exist. So to sum that up is essentially I wanted to write this because I love writing and I love creating, but also it has helped me sort of reconcile like what I want to do is create art that people can see themselves as, that is like diverse and inclusive and also fun. So yeah, that's my little spiel for right now. Thank you for listening to my emotional vulnerability.
Hi, everyone. My name is Clemencia Garcia-Kasimirowski, and I'm a senior, and I will be presenting on basically my thesis for the History of Art and Architecture department. So this map is hopefully going to help orient you in Ritsona, which is a refugee camp in Greece. It's about 75 kilometers outside of Athens. And what my thesis explores is how the residents of this refugee camp have extended beyond the boundaries of humanitarian architectures and really taken agency over the visual culture in the camp. I kind of was able to write this thesis after conducting about 5 weeks of field work in Ritsona. And while I was there, I was working with an NGO, but also interacting with the residents and really just spending time within the camp and understanding what it meant to break beyond the humanitarian boundaries. So I'm very interested in how space is created and how the architectural vocabulary of different actors actually represents or mirrors their political agency, their identity, etc. So my thesis, first of all, examines the space of a refugee camp. What does it look like? How is it shaped, and who shapes it? And first, I examine what humanitarian architectures look like. So as evidenced by this very rectilinear plan, it's clear that the humanitarian outlets that established Ritsona, which were the UNHCR and IOM, which is International Office on Migration, which is based in the EU, created a landscape that was really uniform, rectilinear, very gridded, and super apersonal and acultural. And this is appropriate because it reflects the humanitarian identity in that they're meant to simultaneously help and create architectures and spaces that help people, but actually in being so uniform, they succeed in, I guess, providing a non-personal space, which is arguably problematic, as I see it. And then beyond that, I look at how the residents actually break beyond these very rectilinear spaces and create an architectural landscape in the residential area, which this area is. Oh, actually, I feel very fancy. The residents were actually able to create a visual vocabulary that extended beyond this rectilinear plan. And this is evidenced in this kind of makeshift plan that I have created, where it demonstrates that residents reuse lots of materials from the first lifespan of the camp, so the camp was established in March 2016, and the first life was until November 2016, which is when the UAE, in partnership with the Red Cross, donated ISO boxes, which are these caravans. And they replaced the tents that were previously in the camp. So the residents actually reused the tent and materials from old UNHCR tents and created these protruding tent shapes. And so that is basically how the camp was able to evolve. And I actually argue in my thesis that these freely fabricated, to use a term coined by Irit Katz, who's a scholar on freely fabricated architectures in refugee camps, this freely fabricated architecture is not just a vernacular, but actually signals that the residents are creating sacred spaces for Islamic practice within the camp. So I recognize that Islamic architectures is a really broad term, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. But for the shapes that I saw within the residential area here, i.e. the domestic spaces, I do use the blanket term of an inward-facing courtyard house. And I find that this is really helpful because courtyard houses can be traced in various Islamic traditions, but they're not unique to Islam. But I did find that they function in the same way. So that is to say that the inward-facing courtyard was a multi-purpose space the residents who lived there used it in both a recreational sense, but also a space for prayer, should they need to, in the domestic space. So that was helpful in identifying that kind of architecture as assuming that role. And then the second way in which I identified the inward-looking courtyard house, or the makeshift version of it, is by the hijab, which is the veil which is worn by women. And I argue that, appropriating from a couple of scholars, that by wearing the veil, it enables women to extend the threshold of the home into a public space. So when the veil is removed within the inner courtyard of the house, it actually signals that they have entered a sacred space in that way. Mm-hmm. And then the second identification of a sacred space in Ritsona is actually the mosque, which is this structure. My formatting is not spectacular, but that's okay. So you can see that the mosque also assumes this hybrid of a humanitarian architecture, but also the residents engaging with this freely fabricated visual language, which means that they are employing reused UNHCR tents, wooden pallets, black plastic pallets that were once used to lift the tents up off the ground, in order to create a sacred space. And I actually, in comparison or in contrast to my section on, or my examination on the domestic spaces, assuming this kind of all-encompassing courtyard architecture, I actually found that there were lots of visual parallels between this mosque and Umayyad mosques in Syria. So, and that would be appropriate, seeing as the majority of the residents in Ritsona are from Syria and surrounding areas. So my thesis basically just examines how the residents are able to exercise agency and expanding beyond the humanitarian architectures provided. They're using repurposed materials as a vehicle to do that. And in writing this thesis, I just wanted to make visible an area of scholarship that is pretty much non-existent. I was really surprised to see that very few people touch at all on sacred spaces in refugee camps. So in doing so, I hope to demonstrate that there is a visual vocabulary that is untapped, and it is definitely a wealth of knowledge and worth looking into. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julia Tompkins. I concentrate in English on the nonfiction track, and for my thesis, I wrote a long piece on passenger rail in the United States, so long-form journalism, based on interviews that I did with people on Amtrak trains. This thesis was born out of an article that I wrote my sophomore year with the same title, where I interviewed writers who had done the Amtrak writers residency. If you don't know about it, Amtrak, I think they discontinued it momentarily, but they would provide money for writers so that they could ride around the country on the train, the goal being that they would write while they were on the train, but it was also a social media ploy for Amtrak so they could show that they supported the arts, and these writers would blog about them and tweet about them, and that was very good publicity for Amtrak. So interviewing these writers got me excited about the train, and when it became time to write my thesis, I could not shake the idea of the train. And so I ended up riding around the country from New York to Chicago, then Chicago to Berkeley, California, then Berkeley up to Seattle, and then Seattle back to Chicago. And while I was on the train, I interviewed people at every chance I got, at meal times, in the observation car, which is pictured here. And my goal was to find out why people ride the train when it is not the most practical, it is rarely the most cost-effective, it often takes much longer than any other form of transportation, and yet on the train I met all these people who love it and would choose the train above every other form of travel every other time. So one of the main questions that I would ask people when I was on the train was, why are you here? Why are you on the train? Why aren't you on a plane or in a car? Why are you here? Many of them didn't like to fly. I also want to emphasize that this is all qualitative, not quantitative research. This was a nonfiction thesis, so it was all based on interviews that I did. Many people didn't like to fly. Many oriented their relationship with the train around nostalgia that they had from trips they had taken as children with their parents or trips they had taken alone to visit relatives. Many of them talked about the old Pullman lounge cars, where if you've ever seen pictures of train cars from the 1930s and 40s with beautiful mahogany woodwork and velvet chairs, and that's what people often imagine. Other people took the train because they were tourists visiting the US. They heard it was the best way to travel. And some just wanted to take a long time getting where they were going, and they wanted to see the country. Having done this trip, I can say there was really no better way to see the country than from a train. When you're in a car, at some point your attention will be pulled inwards, but on a train you can spend all of your time looking out, and that's really powerful. Mm-hmm. The other question I asked people was, where do they think passenger rail is going? Common opinion often holds that passenger rail in the US is headed towards its end. People have felt that way since Amtrak became Amtrak in the early 1970s. People felt that way beforehand when the National Highway Network was established in the 50s. So is the rail headed towards its end? Well, actually, in recent years, ridership has gone up. In the last 10 years, by a few percentage points, people are actually riding the train a little bit more than they used to. Yet, we still have infrastructure problems all over the country. The current presidential administration wants to slash the budget for Amtrak and the subsidies that the government gives to Amtrak, which is a public-private corporation. And so many people feel that the railway is headed towards its end. And this was sadly what many people who I talked to felt. They said, I love it, but it's going to end. And many of them were of retirement age or older. The younger people that I talked to, and they were much fewer young people, were excited about it, but they, as well as I, didn't have as much of a connection or didn't see it as much of a part of our history as some of the older people did. But everyone was not hopeful for Amtrak. Instead, they were mourning what they see as this death of the railway that's coming. But that perception may also be misguided. California is trying to make enormous improvements in their rail system to make it more sustainable and affordable and more accessible to people throughout the state. If California is able to implement these changes, other states may one day be able to follow. So I'm still hopeful. Another thing I thought a lot about was who I was on the train. A lot of the people who ride the train and write about riding the train are men. A lot of them are middle-aged. Many of them are white. My experience was very different. People would often ask me, do you feel safe? How is it to be a young woman on the train? I felt fine, but I'm also from a big city, and I've been lucky enough to grow up riding the subway alone and being comfortable in these spaces and comfortable talking to people, and that definitely gave me an advantage. But as you can see here, the country, especially the parts of the country that the train goes through, there aren't often highways. Often it's just you and the train and what's outside, and there's really something to be said for seeing these parts of our country. So this is my project. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out here today to listen to us talk. So I study sociology and lit arts, and where that sort of converges for me is around questions of where do we find community narratives today, whose voices are being heard and whose aren't, and how those stories are being used or exploited to shape our communities. So I was, just thinking about first, where do we find these stories? And I was really interested in the idea of an archive. And I have the definition up there, but really I was, when you think of an archive, it's, a place you store something. It's like hidden away in the archives. If you archive something in your inbox, it disappears somewhere into the ether. So there was really this disconnect between like the archive over here and communities over there, and a very passive engagement, if any, between the two. And so for my senior project, I was thinking about what would a counter movement to archiving look like, and what kind of framework would that be. So I did a little digging online, and I found a very, very tiny body of literature on the idea of an anarchive, which is essentially, right, if an archive is about preservation and storage, an anarchive and archival research is about creation and production of narrative as a form of research. And so this is all I could find online, and I wanted to know more about what that would look like in practice. And so through my senior project, I really wanted to flesh out that narrative and what the critical theory behind that could be. And so sort of that was on one side of what I was really interested in. And then at the same time, I was thinking a lot about the digital divide, and Rhode Island had just become an all-online state, which meant that all our government services, social service benefits are now completely online. And we were being, congratulated as one of the first states to, do that, and civic innovation and technical progress. And, what often doesn't get brought into that conversation, especially in Rhode Island, well, in Providence, 28% of households do not own any digital devices, and 36% of households don't have an internet connection. And there's like a lot of overlap between these populations and those that are applying for social service benefits. And so what that really means is there's a huge dependence in the state of Rhode Island on the public library system. And I was thinking about, well, what are public libraries but an archive? And so I was trying to see if there was a way that I could think about anarchival research as a way to bring about digital justice. And so I started having conversations with the Providence Public Library System, and they were really interested in expanding their digital literacy program. And so I guess the main thesis of my senior project is that digital justice and digital justice programming shouldn't just be about digital literacy, and that it's not just now I can open an email account and access social service benefits online, but it's really about equipping these communities with technical knowledge as a means to empower themselves through technology, to reclaim technology, and do that using anarchival research as, creating and producing their narratives through technology or digitization. And so what that might look like in practice is, radical cartography, right? Open maps and open source maps are everywhere, but what does that tell about the stories of these communities, and can they sort of use mapping techniques to subvert those narratives? It could be, documenting oral histories, right? Or, open data. There's like a whole host of possibilities. So that was sort of what I was thinking about, but my thesis was really about repositioning the public library as a space for this sort of knowledge activism work. And it was very much a piece of critical futurism, critical design, very theoretical. And, that's the first step. But I also wanted to quickly talk about another project that I've been working on this semester, which is really putting anarchival research into practice. And this is through a class I've been taking in the anthropology department with Professor Carter. If you're interested in storytelling as research, she's fabulous, and I highly recommend taking a class with her. But this class is in collaboration with Providence City Arts, which is a free after-school arts program for youth in the city. And we were thinking about, urban mobility and urban design and whose voices are heard there and whose aren't. And often a lot of times, youth voices aren't thought to be valid enough or fully formed or developed enough to matter in these conversations, and are also not very prominent in the anthropological or ethnographic traditions as well for similar reasons. So the class was really about co-producing, co-creating art as a form of narrative storytelling about their experiences in Providence. And I think one of my big takeaways from this was when you're thinking about anarchival research and the materiality that comes with that, it doesn't have to be very sophisticated. It could be glitter and paint and clay, and the insight you're getting out of it is still as valuable, and perhaps even more so. And then the other really great thing I learned through this process was that, in traditional archival research, you're getting data at the final stage of interpreting the final object or text or art, whereas in anarchival research, ideally you're getting data from multiple entry points in the process of creation and the decisions that are going into that process, in the curation process and like grouping objects together, how are they interacting with each other, and then also in the traditional like interpreting the final art. I don't want to talk too much about the art that came out of this, because I do want to put in a quick plug that the gallery exhibition is this Friday from 5:30 onwards at City Arts, which is on the south side. And Brown is doing its thing and organizing a bus tour. So it starts on the main green, and you can drive over, and my professor will sort of on the way talk about our research methodologies. And it would be, if you're interested in this work, it'd be great if you could come out, but also to support the young artists and listen to their stories and hear their voices. So that's what I've been working on senior year. Thank you.